Hey there, Agile Rolling Stones, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we're building software in an agile manner day in and day out. So in our last episode, we were talking about how important it was to create a visualization of the work that you currently have in progress. And we talked about all the different questions that can raise, the different discussions it can prompt, the intelligence that map gives you, and all the different things that it can reveal, really bringing home in a way that other things cannot, the idea of how much you really do have going on, where it all is in progress, and what places are kind of clogged up with the work that you have in progress. And it really helps you make more informed decisions, not only about what you've got in the pipeline right now, but also making decisions about other things you could be working on. And it's this episode where we're going to talk some about that, because usually once people have created the visualization and they see it, 99% of the time, it becomes very apparent that there's too much. You have so many things in progress. Things are sitting around waiting for people. This thing over here was halfway done, and then people quit working on it to go work on this new thing, and it never got finished. Here's this developer, they're working on 5 different projects simultaneously. You begin to see these things, right? And it occurs to you, that the map really shouldn't look like that in an ideal world, right? It should look a lot more manageable than it actually does. So in this episode, we're going to talk about what to do about it, or things that you can do about it. And all of them kind of revolve around the principle of how do we bring this work down, and how do we make sure this doesn't get out of control again? And what are the ramifications of that? Because if you are a manager, here's what happens, especially if you're the person who decides what your team is working on or you participate in that discussion at some level. Lots of people in your organization want stuff from your team. I know that comes as a shock, right? But something we tell all of our clients is, look, I don't care who you are. I don't care how many developers you've got. Every organization wants/needs more software than you have the resources to produce. That's just true everywhere you go. There's more needed or desired work than you have the capacity to produce at any given time. So you're always being asked for more than you can actually do in any kind of a timely manner. So always bear that in mind. Everybody's new request is kind of impossible from one way of looking at it, right? It's always going to be more than you have the capacity to do. But it's really important to that person. Now, sometimes in organizations, people have to get together and create kind of a unified list of these demands, but that is not super common. A lot of times it's more individuals. And even when you have the list of demands, people are kind of wanting to jump the line a little bit. They kind of want you to give priority to their thing because it's very important to them. It may not be the most important thing to the organization as a whole, but it's very important to them. And when that's the case, they're going to start pressuring you. They're going to start wanting you to devote resources to their thing, and they want their thing yesterday. And they will start putting a lot of pressure on you, either passively aggressively or aggressively, to start work on their thing, right? And you will start feeling this pressure. And this is where we really see managers have their first test of courage in a lot of ways. How are you going to respond when that happens? What are you going to do when people are asking you to do things and you know your team is already dedicated to things, or they're currently working on things and someone is really pressuring you to get it done, right? Like, I really need you guys to focus on this thing and get it out the door. What are you going to do in that moment? I'll tell you what a lot of managers do. They feel that pressure. They don't like it. And so they alleviate the pressure by pushing it down to their team. So rather than shielding their team from that pressure, they become a conduit for that pressure. And they go to their team and they start saying things like, hey, we need to get this thing started. Or, hey, we need to move this thing along. Oh, hey, I was in the restroom next to the CEO, and I'm pretty sure he said something similar to change your priorities. Or he might have been burping, I'm not sure, but it sounded like he was saying change priorities, so let's change our priorities. You become a source of pressure for your team instead of someone who protects your team from that pressure. You push it down. And that can look all kinds of ways. Some managers push that pressure down by yelling a lot or demanding status reports or just continually reminding people, hey, we need to get this thing going. We need to get this thing going. We need to get this thing going. And one of the forms of relieving this pressure is you get started on the thing just so you can say you started the thing. Just so you can say, yeah, we started your important thing. My team's on it, right? We got to make progress. And then you can tell that person who's pressuring you to do their thing, we're doing it, and that relieves the pressure and you're happier and, you have a more fulfilling day, I suppose. But you've paid a price, right? You've paid a horrendous price when you make a decision like that, because as soon as you take on something new, you have instantly slowed down everything else that your team is working on, including, ironically, the thing that you just took on. Now, if you're interested in the math behind this, you'll want to look up something called Little's Law. I have done a podcast on Little's Law that you can look up and around the different assumptions of Little's Law and things like that if you're really interested in how the math works. I don't know that you need to be armed with all that necessarily. If you think that armed with mathematics, you can go to your CEO and get them to change their minds about things, I don't know how to break this to you, but that's probably not how that's going to work. I think if anyone has been married, you kind of know that most persuasive discussions aren't won on the field of math. So organizations are not really that different. But just so you know, every time you put something new in progress, you've slowed everything else down. And it just makes sense, right? Like if I give you one task to focus on, you're going to be trending through that task. If I give you another task that I want you to be working on at exactly the same time, you're not going to get that first task done as fast as if I hadn't done that, right? And you're not going to get the second task done as fast as if you could have just focused on that, right? We all know this to be true, but we all lose this common sense when it comes to portfolio planning for some reason. You've also increased your team's wasted time in context switching. There is a lot of time spent in teams trying to turn their attention from this thing to that thing. Again, just think about your own personal workload, right? If you have one thing to focus on, how different is that than if every hour I come over to your desk and say, oh, I also need you to do this. Oh, I also need you to do this. Oh, I also need you to do this. Well, you're going to be switching your intention. Now we got to talk about that second thing, right? You were right in the middle of something else, but now I've interrupted you. Now we have to talk about this second thing, and I got to give you all the context and give you all the background. And now you've got that second thing. And even if you decide to go back to that first thing, well, now you have to figure out where you were. Now you have to reorient yourself. There's time involved in all of that. Right? And that is going to affect your team as well. Every new thing you put on their plate is going to be another opportunity to switch context, which means more wasted time, which slows everything down. And it's not just the context switching time either. It's all the overhead involved in introducing new things. If we're talking about software, it may be, having meetings to talk about the new project and build a context around it and make foundational decisions for it and, gather some high-level requirements from it. There's a lot of time invested just in getting a software effort going, right? Time that you could have been using to finish the thing you were currently doing, right? So all those things factor into it. And then to make matters worse, those obnoxious people pressuring you to start the thing? The odds are pretty good that they are not going to change their expectations for all the other stuff they asked you to do, right? Those things that they asked you to do 3 months ago when you said we're going to be done this month. Oh, but they also want you to do this other thing. Now, you're probably over there thinking, well, that makes no sense, right? If we have a full workload and we said we were going to get done by the end of this month, if somebody comes and pushes something else onto our plate, surely they're not going to expect it to get done by the end of this month too. Oh, you sweet summer child. That would be great, right? That's the way we would expect a person to behave, but that's not the way organizations behave. They gave you a project. They want it done in 3 months. And when you're halfway done, they give you a second project, but they still want the first project done in 3 months. They just also want the second project done as well, right? That's the way they work. And they are not going to adjust their expectations most of the time just because you have another thing to work on. So again, you have gotten started. You are now able to tell that person, yes, my team is making progress on this thing, but you have paid a really, really big price to take that on. And not only are you going to be unhappy with it, not only is your team going to be unhappy with that, but ultimately the person pressuring you to do the thing is going to be unhappy with it because now you've slowed everything down and now they're just going to be chomping at the bit for you to get the thing done, but you've created a situation where you're just going to be slower and slower and slower and slower. So you've just deferred disappointing that person, and that's going to be a very, very different conversation. So what you need to do is you need to kind of lose this instinct that if something is important, you need to start it. That is not true. Everything is important. Everything that everybody asks you for is going to be important. They're sure going to think so, right? You need to lose the instinct that something important has to be done, something valuable has to be done. Ergo, we should start as soon as we possibly can. You don't want to do that because you don't want to start that new thing. You want to finish that new thing, right? And the quickest way to get the new thing finished may very well to be delay the start so that you can get this other stuff done first so that you can focus on this new thing. But you don't just want to start new things and start new things and start new things while you still have a bunch of stuff that's currently being worked on. So what do you do instead? Well, you may have read some about Kanban or, been familiar with some of the discussions in the Agile community or lean communities around work and software work. And you've probably heard talk about limiting your work in progress, right? Limiting WIP. And if you've looked at all at Kanban, Kanban does this explicitly, right? You declare a number that represents the maximum number of things you can have going on at one time effectively. Some teams will do that at a stage-by-stage level, right? So we can only have 2 things in requirements gathering. We can only have 4 things being coded. We can only have 2 things being tested, whatever your thing is. I would generally encourage you not to do that. If you're just starting out, that's a decent way to get started, I guess. And it's not terrible. It's just the problem is when you set different limits at each stage, you can kind of WIP limit your way around genuine bottlenecks that your system has. It sort of hides your problems in a sense. So I recommend if you are going to set a WIP limit, like an actual numerical limit to how much you can have in progress at once, do it for like the whole system or at least broad swaths of the system. Instead of saying we can only have 2 things in requirements, 4 things in development, and 2 things in testing, just say we can only have 8 things going on prior to deployment. Then what that allows you to do is it allows you to see where things bunch up naturally, and that will show you great places to improve. If you set individual WIP limits across that process, it's going to be harder to see those things. It's not impossible. It's just you can hide a lot through those column WIP limits. Doesn't mean they're evil. Doesn't mean don't ever do them. I'm just saying eventually you'll kind of want to grow out of that. So if you are going to set that WIP limit, what's the right number, right? What's the magic number? This is what everybody wants to know. And I will tell you that with most organizations that I work with, this is usually their initial reasoning. Okay, well, we think it makes sense to set a limit to how much we can have going on at any given time. We say, hey, we're maxed out. Like this is the most we could possibly be doing and be effective and be efficient. And what they think of is they think, okay, well, how many people have I got on my team? I have 6. So each of them can be working on an item. And then, they may have something that's blocked and I want them to be working on something else. So we'll just say 2 items for every person. So I've got 6 people on my team. We should have a WIP limit of 12. This is the exact opposite of the way you want to think about this. I mean, think about what you're saying. If each individual person is working on an item, you have spread your resources as thin as they can physically be spread. And then you've added a whole new extra dimensional, I need a TARDIS to make this work layer by hypothesizing about a blocked item that they will abandon to work on a second thing. So now a single person actually has 2 items in progress, and woe betide that person when their blocker clears up. And now all of a sudden they have 2 things on their plate that they're responsible for simultaneously. So what you want to do when you're coming up with that number, and it can be experimental, right? You don't have to carve it in stone, but you want to think about, I want multiple people working on the highest priority. I don't want to spread the work so thin that I have one person on every single thing. Yeah, some things are one-person jobs for sure. I'm not saying stack people just to stack people, but you want as many people on your highest priority item as possible that are still going to make good forward progress. You also want a little bit of slack in your system so that you can be responsive. Now, this is anathema to a lot of managers because a lot of managers like to capacity plan, right? How can I maximize the amount of work that's in progress right now? But think about it kind of like a highway. Do you want a highway full of cars? How fast are things going to move when the highway is full of cars? Not very fast, right? You need some space in there. You need some room so that people can change lanes. Fast people can go around the slow people. If someone needs to brake all of a sudden, they have room to do that, and there's not going to be an accident that clogs up the rest of the thing, right? You need some room in the system to maneuver, to be responsive, right? And you need capacity in your system for emergencies. You need capacity in your system for when another department gets back to you and you have to make a change all of a sudden. If everyone is already maxed out, they can't be responsive. Carve that onto a plate that you put on your desk. If your team is maxed out, they cannot be responsive. You can only be responsive if you have the capacity to respond. Where's that capacity going to come from? You have to build it. And that's why you don't want a WIP limit that maxes your team out. You want to cut under that to some extent. And the other thing is, whatever the slowest point in your process is, you don't want to overload that. There's no reason for everyone else to be producing twice as much as some other point can handle, right? If you have 2 testers and 18 developers, guess what's going to happen? Your testers' backlog is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's going to get slower and slower and slower and slower, right? You want to find some level of equilibrium with whatever the slowest point in the chain is. We usually call that the constraint, and it's the thing that kind of governs the speed of the whole system. And you want to accommodate the constraint. You don't want to overload it. You don't want to fight against it. You want to harness it for power, right? So when you're thinking about your WIP limit, think about that. Generally speaking, what I usually do to start is I take the team size and I cut it in half. And if the team is large, then I might add 1 or 2 to that number. So if I got a team of 6, their WIP limit is 3, right? And that begins to force some of the behaviors that you want. And occasionally, you might have someone who doesn't have something to focus on that day. They can still do productive things, right? And they have the capacity to take on any kind of emergencies or jump in and help, or whatever needs to happen as things come up. And then you can kind of play with that number. That's probably not the right number, but it at least gives you a point of reference and you can see if it needs to be a little higher or a little bit lower. There's also healthy working habits that if you do them, they will naturally keep your work in progress limited, even without numerical WIP limits. For example, only start something new after you have finished something in progress. I know how that sounds, right? It sounds like the thing you might say to a child, right? But man, organizations just don't do this. They just start stuff, regardless of whether they've finished stuff or not. And you can do wonderful things for the efficiency of your workflow just by implementing that one simple policy. Make your developers do it. Hey, don't start a new work item until you have finished the one that you're currently working on. The team, don't pull in a new user story until we've delivered a user story, right? So you are equalizing the rate at which work comes into your system and the rate at which work leaves your system, right? You want those rates to be pretty similar, and then you're not overloading the system. You want to put as many people on a work item as possible, like I said before. Why would you want to slow down your highest priority item just in the name of making a little progress on something that's not as valuable? You don't want to do that. That doesn't make any sense, right? That's not how a smart manager allocates things. So we want our teams to get into the habit of whatever our highest priority item is, whatever the most valuable thing is we could be working on, let's have as many people knocking that out as possible. Now, eventually you're going to hit a ceiling on that, right? If you've got a user story and it's a small piece of functionality, you're not going to put 18 developers on it, right? But You can still put a lot on there. They can mob program through it. They can pair program through it. One person can be doing the API while another person's doing the UI. There's all kinds of ways to get that done, but the principle is you want to put as many people on the most important thing as you can. You only want to contemplate pulling something new if there's nothing that people can be doing to move the highest priority thing forward. You also want to prioritize your older items. So when you're looking at all the items that are in progress, which ones have only been in there a day or two, and which ones have been there like a week or two, or 3 or 4 or whatever. You want to make sure that your teams are prioritizing those older items. Get them out the door. If you got an item sitting in there that's, twice as old as everything else, your team needs to be asking the question, what can we possibly do to get this done? The odds are pretty good there's only one person working on that thing. So this is a great opportunity for you to go in your daily stand-up, hey, from a tactical point of view, does it make sense for you to be working on this 2-day-old item when we got this 1-month-old item that isn't done yet? Is there something you could do to help? Is there something you could be doing to push it out the door? Well, let's block this 2-day-old item and get this ancient thing out the door. And if you and your teams begin to adopt the perspective of prioritizing the thing that has aged the longest, that naturally is going to keep your WIP done because you're going to get things out the door that are clogging up your system, right? Which means you're going to be able to move things through more quickly, which means that you're going to be delivering faster. You also want to let your constraint kind of dictate the pace of your system. And that's why it's important to find what your constraint is. Maybe it's testing. Maybe it's developing. Maybe it's the release process. There's something in your pipeline that takes longer than the other things in your pipeline. You need to find what that is. Now, that doesn't mean that the people doing that job are bad at their job. There's all kinds of reasons that that's the constraint. Maybe you only have a couple of people working on it. Maybe it demands a very specialized skill set and you can't just hire 20 people to do that thing. Maybe the work at that stage requires a really long time, and that's why that's the slowest part of your process. But whatever it is, whatever your constraint is, you kind of want to adjust the flow of your system to match what your constraint can handle, or to at least be in the neighborhood of what your constraint can handle. You are making life a lot worse for everybody if each individual stage in the process is churning as fast as it can. Think about like machines in a manufacturing plant, right? So raw materials go into one machine, they get transformed, they go to the next machine, more things happen, they go to the next machine, more things happen, and then finally it gets out the door, right? Well, let's say that middle machine can only process at half the speed as the first machine. Do you want the first machine to be going as fast as it can? No, you don't, right? Because what's going to happen is a bunch of stuff is going to pile up in front of that second machine, and eventually it's going to shut your line down. Well, a very similar thing happens in knowledge work, right? So you want to find out like how fast do things move through the different stages of my process? Where do they move the slowest? Okay, I kind of want that to govern how things flow through the other stages as well. There's no point in overburdening that part of the process. They can't move it any faster no matter what you do. Piling more things in front of them isn't going to make them faster. So there's no point in doing it. And you might be able to use those extra people upstream to do other things. Maybe help the people downstream, for example, right? There's all kinds of things you can do. But if you're doing those things, if you are only starting new work after you finish something, if you're putting as many people on the highest priority as you can, if you're prioritizing the oldest items, and you're keeping an eye on the slowest part of the process and letting that kind of dictate the overall pace, then your WIP is going to stay down whether you have WIP limits or not. It's just going to naturally force you to work at the right pace. And there are specific ways you can do that. I'll probably do that in another episode, show you in a very practical way, a very practical scheduling system for your work items that takes these things into account. I'm not going to do that now because I've already talked a long time, but I just want to get you into the idea that you can't just start new work. You don't want to, and your heart is going to want to. Don't do it, okay? Don't give in to the pressure. Recognize the reality that your team can only effectively do so much, and any more than that is just going to start screwing everything up. Quality is going to go down, speed is going to go down. We need to have good, solid limits in place so that our team can work as effectively as possible. And when we have that, we're going to make everybody happy. Because yeah, I might not be able to start your thing for 2 weeks, but when I do, we are going to burn right through it, right? And we're going to get it to you much faster than if we tried to work on your thing while we were also working on 4 other things. Remember, as a manager, you want to optimize for delivery. You don't want to optimize for starting stuff, right? We only get points when we deliver value, and that's what we want to work around. So I hope this has given you something to think about. A lot of people are very resistant to the idea of limiting how much they're working on at any given time. Even the members of your team, like you think they would like it, man, some of them are going to hate it too. But it's really, really necessary in order to have software production where things are moving at the speed that you really want them to. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.